The night Evie Marsh walked the marble floor for the third and final time, the candles in the choosing hall burned low and gold, as though even the flames were tired of watching her be passed over. She had counted the steps once, on her first gala, when she still believed the walk might end differently. 47 steps from the herald's platform to the raised dais, where the masked alphas stood in their finery, each one a silhouette of power and possibility, each one a door that had never opened for her. Tonight she did not count. Tonight she watched the hem of her gown, the same dove-gray silk she had altered twice now, once to hide the mend at the bodice, and once to lower the neckline because her guardian's wife had said, with the careful cruelty of someone who believed she was helping, that perhaps Evie's problem was that she dressed like a governess attending a funeral. The fabric whispered against the marble. Somewhere in the gallery above, a woman leaned toward her companion and said something behind her fan, and the companion laughed, and the sound fell through the hall like a coin dropped into a well. Evie kept walking. She had learned, across 3 galas, that the worst thing you could do was stop. If you stopped, they remembered your face. If you kept moving, you were just another gray dress passing through candlelight, already half forgotten before you reached the end. The masked alphas turned as the herald called her name. She felt their gazes land on her one by one, brief as moths touching a window, and then lift away. The first, a broad-shouldered alpha from the Greenvale house, shifted his weight and studied the ceiling. The second, a younger son of the Ashford line, actually turned his back, which was not technically a refusal under gala law, but accomplished the same thing with less paperwork. The third and fourth did not bother to look at all. Evie reached the dais. The court matron, a thin woman named Sister Calworth, whose quill had ended more futures than any war, lifted her pen above the open ledger. The ink would mark the page. The page would mark Evie's life. 3 refusals, and the ward was transferred to the Sisters of the Long Watch, the cloistered order that took the unchosen and the inconvenient and folded them into silence. And no one Evie had ever known who entered the Long Watch had ever come back out. Sister Calworth's hand was steady. She had done this before. What she had not done before, what no one in the choosing hall had done before, was hear the voice that came from the shadowed archway to the left of the dais, low and unhurried, and carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. "I will take her." The quill stopped. The hall stopped. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath, flames leaning inward as though straining to see. Evie turned, and from the archway stepped a man who was not wearing a mask, which was itself a violation of the gala's oldest rules, the kind of violation that should have brought the hall marshals forward with their ceremonial rods and their stern recitations of protocol. No one moved. No one was going to move, because the man crossing the marble floor was Flint Core, Alpha King of the Hollowore pack, and the last person who had corrected Flint Core on a point of etiquette was rumored to be living very comfortably in a small cottage on the northern border, having decided quite suddenly that retirement suited him. Flint was tall in the way that northern men were tall, built for cold and stone and the kind of silence that lived between mountains. His jaw was cut sharp beneath dark stubble. His black hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and deep-set gray eyes. And there was a scar that ran from his left temple to the hinge of his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin, as though someone had once tried to open him up and found nothing inside that yielded. His court called him the Bone King behind his back. His previous betrothed, a daughter of the powerful Ashenmere house, had fled across the border 3 months before the bonding ceremony, and the story that circulated through every gala and every noble hall was that she had looked into Flint Cora's eyes on the night of their engagement feast, and seen something in them that made her choose exile over consummation. He wore black. Of course he wore black. He wore it like armor, like a statement, like a man who had decided long ago that color was a concession he was unwilling to make. He crossed the marble floor in long, unhurried strides, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for the prow of a ship, not because they chose to, but because the alternative was to be broken against him. Evie had 8 seconds. She knew this because her heart beat 8 times between the moment he spoke and the moment he reached her, and each beat was a separate, distinct percussion against her ribs, loud enough that she was certain he could hear it. In those 8 seconds, she did something that surprised her and, she suspected, surprised him. She did not curtsy. She did not lower her eyes. She looked at him directly, this man whose name was spoken in whispers, and she asked, quietly, so that only he could hear, "Why?" He looked down at her. Up close, his eyes were not simply gray. They were the color of winter rivers, pale and deep, and moving beneath a surface that appeared still. Something shifted in them when she spoke. Something that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but lived in the narrow country between the two. He answered her just as quietly, his voice pitched beneath the murmur of the watching crowd. "My regent has called a vote of no confidence at the next full moon. I need a witnessed consort by then, or I lose Hollowore to a cousin who will gut it for timber rights and mineral leases. You need someone to claim you before that quill touches paper. We both get what we need." Evie stared at him. The candles flickered. Somewhere in the gallery, the woman with the fan had gone very quiet. "That is not a romantic reason," Evie said. "No," Flint agreed. "It is not." And then he extended his hand, palm up, and Evie Marsh, who had been passed over 3 times, who owned 1 dress and no future, who had 8 seconds ago been destined for the silence of the long watch, placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. They were warm and rough and impossibly steady. And something in Evie's chest, something small and quiet and nameless, turned over once, like a bird shifting in its sleep. The carriage ride to Hollowore took 3 days, and Flint Core spent most of it on the opposite bench, with his arms crossed and his eyes closed, which Evie might have taken as rudeness if she had not noticed, on the second morning, that he was not actually sleeping. His breathing was too controlled, too measured, the kind of deliberate stillness that belonged to a man who was listening to everything and choosing to respond to none of it. The carriage was well appointed, better than anything Evie had ridden in before, with furs across the seats and a small iron brazier bolted to the floor that kept the mountain air from biting. Flint had handed her a heavy wool cloak when they left the capital, without comment, and she had wrapped it around herself and tried not to notice that it smelled like pine smoke and cold stone, and something beneath both that was distinctly, disturbingly him. On the first evening, they stopped at a way station, and Flint's man, a wiry, sharp-eyed beta named Lanford, who drove the carriage and carried 2 knives and a dry sense of humor, brought them supper in the private room Flint had arranged. Evie sat across from Flint at the small table and ate in silence for several minutes before he set down his fork and looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as his version of patience, which mostly resembled a man enduring a toothache with dignity. "You should know the arrangement," he said. "I know the arrangement. You told me. 6 weeks, a pretense, and then you release me with land, coin, and a forged widow's record. There is more." Evie set down her own fork. "Tell me." "Hollowore's court has bond witnesses. They are old bloodlines, trained from birth to sense the resonance of a true bond. They can read it across a room. Every meal, every public appearance, every moment we are observed. They will be watching for proof that the bond between us is real and consummated. And it will not be. No. So we are performing a play for an audience that can smell a lie. Flint's jaw tightened. It was, she was learning, his primary form of emotional expression. That small flexion of muscle beneath the scar, as though his face had been allocated a limited budget for feeling, and he spent it all in the hinge of his jaw. The bond witnesses read resonance, not truth. If we are close enough, often enough, if we learn each other's rhythms, there is a chance the proximity itself will create enough ambient resonance to satisfy a casual reading. And a non-casual reading? Then we have a problem. Evie considered this. She considered the sisters of the Long Watch, the silence, the closed doors, the women who entered and were never seen again. She considered the dove-gray dress folded in her single trunk, the only possession she had carried out of her old life. She considered the way the gallery had laughed. "I will need better clothes," she said. Something moved across Flint's face, quick and unreadable. "You will have them." "And a room of my own." "You will have a room, but it must adjoin mine, and the door between must remain unlocked. The bond witnesses will note a locked door. And you will not enter without my permission." Flint looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes were steady, and in them Evie saw something she had not expected to find in the Bone King's gaze. Something that looked, if she tilted her head and allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope, like respect. "I will not enter without your permission," he said. "You have my word." The word of the Bone King. The word of Flint Core. He said it simply, without flourish, and Evie understood that to him there was a difference. Lanford knocked on the door and entered with a pot of tea, glanced between them, and said with absolute neutrality, "Shall I make up one room or two, my lord?" "Two," Flint said. "Adjacent," Evie added. Lanford's eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch, which was apparently the maximum range of his emotional display, and Evie thought that he and Flint must get along beautifully, two men communicating entirely through jaw muscles and eyebrow increments. Hollowore was not what she expected. She had expected dark stone and darker halls, a fortress of cold and severity to match its alpha. What she found, as the carriage crested the final ridge and the valley opened below them, was a sprawling keep of pale gray granite set against a mountainside so steep it seemed to lean into the sky, surrounded by terraced gardens that, even in early spring, were beginning to green. A river wound through the valley floor, silver and fast, and along its banks clustered the homes and workshops of the pack's common folk, smoke rising from chimneys in thin white threads. It was beautiful. It was unexpected. And standing at the keep's main gate, arranged in a precise line of descending height, was the welcoming party. Flint's household guard in their black leather and gray wool, and at the front of the line, a small girl of perhaps 5 years, with wild copper hair and a gap-toothed grin, who broke formation the instant the carriage door opened and hurled herself at Flint's legs with enough force to stagger a lesser man. "You came back," the girl said into his knee. Flint looked down at her, and Evie watched, with the stunned attention of someone witnessing a geological event, as the Bone King's face did something extraordinary. It softened. The hard lines around his eyes eased, the set of his jaw released. He crouched down, slowly, the way a large animal lowers itself to the ground to appear less threatening, and he said, in a voice Evie had not heard him use before, low and rough and unbearably gentle, "I told you I would, Trinity." "You were gone 9 days. You said 7. The roads were slow. You could have run. You are faster when you run." I had company. Trinity turned and looked at Evie with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has not yet learned that staring is rude. She had green eyes, startlingly bright against her copper hair, and a smudge of what appeared to be charcoal on her chin. Is she the one? She asked Flint. She is my consort. Is she the one, though? Something passed across Flint's face, too quick to read. Go find Lanford and ask him about the honey cakes he bought at the way station. Trinity's eyes went wide, and she was gone, a copper blur streaking toward the carriage with a shriek of delight that echoed off the granite walls. Flint straightened. He did not look at Evie. My ward, he said, his voice returned to its usual controlled register. Her parents were border folk, killed in the last raid. She is not afraid of you. No. Everyone else appears to be afraid of you. Trinity has not yet learned to be afraid of the things she should fear. It is, depending on the day, either her greatest strength or my deepest concern. He said it flatly, but Evie heard the thread beneath, the taut wire of tenderness that a man like Flint would never name, but could not quite conceal. She filed it away. She was beginning to build a map of him, this man she would pretend to be bonded to, and the map's most important landmarks were the places where his armor was thinnest. Hollowore's head of household, a stout beta woman named Lynn, who wore her silver hair in a crown braid and carried a ring of keys that could have doubled as a weapon, showed Evie to her rooms. They were large, warm, furnished with heavy dark wood and furs of silver and white, and the window overlooked the terraced gardens and the river below. The adjoining door stood open. Through it, Evie could see Flint's chambers, spare and ordered, a soldier's room and a king's keep, a desk covered in papers, a narrow bed, a single candle, unlit. He does not sleep much, Lynn said, following Evie's gaze. Never has. What does he do instead? Worries, paces, reads reports from the border, worries more. Lynn looked at Evie with an expression that was difficult to parse, something between assessment and the faintest ghost of hope. You are not what the court expected. What did the court expect? Someone who looked like she belonged here. Evie met the older woman's eyes and smiled, and the smile had an edge to it, finely honed by 3 galas and a lifetime of being found insufficient. Then the court will have to adjust its expectations. The first test came at dinner. Hollowmore's great hall was built for 100 but set for 30, and every one of those 30 seats was occupied by a member of Flint's inner court, who had arranged themselves, Evie suspected, less for dining and more for observation. She identified the bond witnesses immediately. There were 3 of them, seated at different points around the long table, and they watched with an attention that was not hostile, but was so thorough it felt like being read aloud. The eldest was a weathered woman named Dexter, which Evie found unexpectedly charming for a bond witness, and she sat at the table's far end with her hands folded and her pale eyes moving between Evie and Flint with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Flint had briefed her in the corridor outside. Sit close. Let our arms touch. When I speak to you, lean in. If I touch your hand, do not flinch. I do not flinch. Everyone flinches the first time. I have been flinched at by experts, my lord. I assure you, I am immune. He had looked at her then, a quick sidelong glance that held something she could not quite name, and then he had offered his arm, and they had walked into the great hall together, and Evie had felt every eye in the room land on her, and take her measure, and find her, she was certain, wanting. She sat beside him. Their arms touched. The bench was narrow enough that his thigh pressed against hers, warm even through the layers of wool and linen, and she was acutely, irritatingly aware of the heat of him, the size of him, the way the air between them seemed to thicken and hum. She told herself it was proximity. She told herself it was performance. She told herself it was not, absolutely not, the faintest thread of something pulling taut in the center of her chest. Flint served her before himself, which was, according to the customs Lanford had hurriedly explained during the ride, a bonded alpha's declaration of provision. He placed the choicest cuts on her plate with a precision that was almost clinical, and when his fingers brushed the back of her hand as he set down a bread roll, Evie did not flinch. She did something worse. She leaned into the touch, just slightly, a fractional shift of her body toward his that was not performed, was not calculated, was not part of any arrangement discussed in any carriage. And she saw Flint's hand still for a half-second before he withdrew it. Across the hall, old Dexter's pale eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with interest. After dinner, Flint walked her to her chamber door. The corridor was empty, the torches burning low, and in the orange half-light, his face was all shadow and scar and the faint gleam of gray eyes, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That was adequate," he said. "High praise from the Bone King." "Do not call me that." "Then do not call adequate what we both know was exceptional." I did not flinch once. His jaw flexed. 1, 2. She was learning to count them. "You leaned into my hand." "Part of the performance." Was it? It was not a question. It was a statement wrapped in a question's clothing, and it hung between them in the torchlight like smoke. Evie reached for the door handle. "Good night, Flint." He caught her wrist, not hard, not rough, just a press of fingers against her pulse, brief and warm, and she felt her heartbeat jump against his touch, and knew he felt it too. "Good night, Evie." He said her name the way other men said prayers, low and careful, as though it was something that could break if held too tightly. Then he released her, and she closed the door, and she stood in the dark of her new room, with her hand pressed to her chest, where the nameless thing had turned over again, wider now, warmer, less like a sleeping bird, and more like a flame catching its first breath of air. The days took on a rhythm. Mornings, Evie explored the keep, mapping its corridors and stairways and hidden gardens, with the methodical attention of a woman who had spent her life learning the architecture of places she did not belong to. She found the kitchens and befriended the cook, a massive, gentle man named Arlo, who spoke primarily through the medium of soup, and who, upon learning she had never eaten proper Hollowore root stew, looked at her with such profound pity that she nearly laughed. She found the library, vast and dusty and organized by a system that appeared to involve intuition and spite. And she spent hours there, reading histories of the northern pacts, learning the names and allegiances she would need to navigate court. She found Trinity, or rather, Trinity found her, appearing at her elbow with the unerring instinct of a child who has identified the adult most likely to be charmed by her. Trinity showed her the secret passage behind the tapestry in the West Hall, which led to a small stone room that Trinity called her castle, and which contained, in no particular order, 14 pine cones arranged by size, a truly spectacular collection of interesting rocks, 3 drawings of wolves that were surprisingly good for a 5-year-old, and a small gray cat with one ear who was called Duchess, and who tolerated Evie's presence with the regal indifference of her name. "Flint found Duchess in a trap on the border," Trinity said, stroking the cat's remaining ear. "She was bleeding and scared, and she bit him twice, but he wrapped her in his cloak and carried her all the way home, and now she sleeps on his desk when he works late." "Does she bite him still?" "Only when he forgets to feed her, but he never forgets." Trinity looked up at Evie with those startling green eyes. "Are you going to stay?" The question was simple. The weight of it was not. "I am here now," Evie said, which was not an answer, and Trinity, who was 5 but not foolish, seemed to know it. Afternoons, Evie walked the grounds with Flint, arm in arm, performing for the watchers they both knew were there. The bond witnesses rotated their observations, but Dexter was always present, her pale gaze tracking them from a garden bench or a courtyard window. Flint was stiff at first, his arm rigid beneath Evie's hand, his conversation limited to the kind of careful, neutral topics that could have been generated by a particularly boring almanac. Weather, crop yields, the structural integrity of the east wall. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," Evie told him on the third afternoon, as they walked the lower garden path beside the river. "I am being thorough. You are being wooden." No bond witness in the history of the supernatural world has ever looked at a couple discussing masonry and thought, "Ah, yes, true mates." His jaw flexed. "What do you suggest?" "Talk to me as though you find me interesting." "I do find you interesting." He said it without inflection, without emphasis, in the same tone he might have used to note that the river was high this season. And yet something in it rang true in a way that made Evie's step falter. She recovered. She was good at recovering. "Then show it. Tell me something real, something the Bone King would never say in court." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would refuse. The river murmured beside them. The early spring wind carried the scent of snowmelt and pine. "I am afraid," he said. Evie looked up at him. His profile was hard against the mountain sky, the scar a pale line from temple to jaw, and his eyes were fixed on the far ridge, where the pines thinned to bare rock, and the border markers stood like teeth against the horizon. Of what? Of failing them. The pack. Trinity. The border folk who have no one else. My cousin Harlan has the council's ear and the lowland lord's gold, and if he takes Hollowore, he will sell the timber rights and the mineral leases, and the border folk will starve or scatter, and Trinity will become a ward of whatever house will take her, and she will walk a marble floor in a gray dress, and someone will laugh. He said it flatly, without self-pity, and Evie understood with sudden, piercing clarity that the Bone King's coldness was not cruelty. It was compression. It was a man who felt so much that he had learned to fold it down and down and down until it fit inside a locked chest in the center of his chest, because if he ever let it expand to its true size, it would break him open. "That will not happen," Evie said. "You do not know that." "No, but I know what it feels like to be the girl in the gray dress. And I know that you carried a one-eared cat home in your cloak. And I know that Trinity ran to you at the gate, and you crouched down for her. And a man who does that does not lose. Not to a cousin with a ledger." Flint looked at her. The gray eyes were not still now. They were moving, shifting, and in their depths, Evie saw something crack open, brief and bright, like light through a fissure in stone. He did not speak. He took her hand, not for the watchers, not for the bond witnesses, not for the performance. He took her hand because he needed to hold something, and she was there, and she let him. The arrangement was supposed to be simple. It was not simple. Evie felt it first as disruption, a wrongness in the space between them that was, paradoxically, the absence of wrongness. She woke in the night to the low sound of Flint pacing in his room beyond the adjoining door, and she lay in the dark and listened to his footsteps and felt the thread in her chest pull toward the sound, like a compass needle finding north. She brushed his hand at breakfast and felt warmth bloom under her skin, a hum that lingered for minutes after the touch ended. She caught his scent on the cloak he had lent her, pine and stone and smoke, and breathed it in before she could stop herself, and the nameless thing in her chest turned over again, wider now, a slow unfurling, and she thought, with the cold clarity of a woman who has survived by seeing things as they are, this is not performance. Something was happening. Something real. something that lived in the charged space between pretense and truth, in the way his voice dropped when he said her name, in the way her pulse steadied when he was near, in the way old Dexter watched them with that patient, knowing gaze, and occasionally, just occasionally, smiled. On the 9th night, Evie could not sleep. She rose and wrapped the cloak around her shoulders and went to the library, where she found the candles already burning and Flint sitting at the long table with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. It was fear. Not the controlled, compressed fear he had described by the river, but something raw, something freshly opened. And when he looked up at her, his gray eyes were bright with it. "What happened?" she asked. "Harlan has moved the vote forward, 3 weeks instead of 6. "Can he do that?" "He has the council majority. He can do what he likes." "Then we have 3 weeks. We have 3 weeks to convince a room full of bond witnesses and council elders that a bond exists between us that does not." Evie sat down across from him. The candlelight moved across his face, and she saw the scar, the jaw, the tight line of his mouth, and beneath it all, the man who was afraid of a little girl walking a marble floor. "Flint?" He looked at her. "What if it does?" The silence that followed was so complete that Evie could hear the candle flames breathing. Flint's hand, the one holding the letter, trembled once, a minute vibration, and then went still. "You feel it," he said, not a question. "I feel something." "The hum." "Yes." "The pull." "Yes." "When I say your name." "Yes." He set the letter down. He placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, as though bracing himself against something that was about to shift the ground beneath him. "The bond witnesses are not wrong to look for what they are looking for," he said carefully. "A true resonance cannot be manufactured, but it can be nascent, unformed, a seed that proximity and emotional connection have begun to germinate." "Are you telling me you have feelings for me, using the language of agriculture?" His jaw flexed. 1, 2, 3, a record. "I am telling you that if we stop pretending there is nothing between us and allow whatever this is to breathe, the bond witnesses may read a genuine resonance. Not a full bond, but enough. And after the vote, when the 6 weeks are up, when you are supposed to release me with land and coin and a forged widow's record?" He did not answer immediately. His hands were still flat on the table, and Evie saw the tension in his forearms, the rigid control of a man who was holding himself in place by force of will. "I would not hold you to anything," he said quietly. "The arrangement stands. When this is over, you are free. That has not changed." But I would be lying if I said I wanted you to go." It was the most words she had heard him speak about anything that was not defensive strategy or structural engineering, and each one landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward, outward, until her whole body hummed with them. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His fingers turned, laced through hers, and held on. After that night, the pretense shifted. It did not become truth, not yet, but it became something liminal, a space between, a breath held between inhale and exhale. They walked closer. They spoke more. Flint began to talk to her in the evenings, real conversation, not performance, and Evie learned the shape of him, the geography of his history. You told her about his father, the previous Alpha King, who had been fair and strong, and had died of a wasting sickness that no healer could name. He told her about his mother, who had followed her mate into death within a season, the bond between them so deep that its severing was unsurvivable. He told her about the regent, Lord Amos, who had been his father's closest advisor, who had guided Flint through the first years of his rule, who had been the steady hand on the tiller when the young Alpha was still learning to hold the wheel. "You trust him," Evie said. "With my life." Evie filed this away too. Her map of Flint was growing, and some of the landmarks were beginning to trouble her, though she could not yet say why. Trinity, meanwhile, had decided that Evie was hers. The child appeared every morning with a new offering, a pine cone of particular distinction, a drawing of a wolf that was actually a drawing of Duchess the cat that was actually a drawing of a potato, a smooth river stone that Trinity claimed was magic because it was warm on one side and cold on the other. "She does this," Lynn told Evie, watching from the kitchen doorway as Trinity dragged Evie by the hand toward the garden to show her a frog. "Attaches. She attached to Flint the same way, like a vine to a wall." "Is that a warning?" "It is an observation." The last woman Flint brought here did not bother to learn Trinity's name. She left 3 months later, and Trinity did not speak for a week. Evie watched the copper-haired girl crouching by the garden pond, chattering at the frog with the earnest intensity of a diplomat conducting treaty negotiations, and she felt something in her chest that was not the hum, not the pull, but something older and simpler, the fierce, uncomplicated desire to protect. The bond witnesses continued to watch. Dexter, the eldest, had taken to sitting in the garden during Evie and Flint's afternoon walks, always at a distance, always with that patient, metronome gaze. One afternoon, Evie found herself alone with the old woman in the corridor outside the great hall, and Dexter stopped her with a hand on her arm. "You are not what I expected," Dexter said. "I hear that often. I mean it differently than they do. I've witnessed 40 years of bonds, child. True bonds, false bonds, forced bonds, broken bonds. I know what resonance feels like the way a musician knows a tuned string." Evie's heart hammered. And what I feel between you and the Alpha King is not a full bond. Not yet." The old woman's pale eyes held hers. "But it is not nothing. It is the sound a string makes when you bring it close to its mate. A sympathetic vibration. Given time, given trust, given courage, it will tune. And if it does not, then it does not. But I have never felt a sympathetic vibration this strong that did not eventually become a chord." Dexter released her arm and walked away, and Evie stood in the corridor with her hand over her heart, feeling the hum, and knew that the line between pretense and truth had become so thin that a single breath could tear it. The betrayal came from the direction Evie was not watching, which was, she would later understand, exactly the point. It was the 15th day, just over a week before the advanced vote, and Lord Amos, the regent, requested a private audience with Evie in the solar. He was a distinguished man, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of warm, paternal manner that made you want to confide in him, and Evie nearly did. He asked about her comfort. He asked about the keep. He asked, with the gentlest possible touch, about the bond. "I only ask," he said, pouring her tea with steady hands, "because I care for Flint as though he were my own son. His well-being is my only concern. I want to be certain that this union is genuine, that it will hold, that the council's vote will not be compromised by any question of legitimacy." He smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of being trusted. "The bond witnesses seem satisfied," Evie said carefully. "Old Dexter is satisfied by very little, in my experience. She is thorough, but she is also sentimental. The council will require more than sympathetic vibration." "What will the council require?" "Proof of consummation, a formal claiming mark. the visible evidence that the bond has been sealed. Evie set down her tea. That is a matter between Flint and me. Of course, of course. Amos raised both hands in a gesture of concession. I only mention it because the vote is in 9 days, and Harlan's faction has been making inquiries. Pointed inquiries. About the nature of your arrival, about the haste of the claiming, about the lack of a visible mark. His voice was gentle, concerned, utterly reasonable, and something in Evie's chest went cold. Not the hum, not the pull, something older, something that lived in the bones of a woman who had spent her life navigating the smiles of people who did not wish her well. She thanked him. She left. She found Lanford in the stables and asked him, in a voice she kept very level, how long Amos had been corresponding with Harlan's faction. Lanford went still. What makes you ask that? Instinct? Your instinct is good. He said it quietly, looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. The dry humor gone, replaced by something serious and sharp. I have been watching Amos for 3 years. The letters go through a baker in the lower village. I have never been able to prove it, but the timing is always the same. Amos meets with Flint, advises a course of action, and within days, Harlan's faction moves to counter it. Flint trusts him. Flint trusted his father, who trusted Amos. It is inherited trust, which is the most dangerous kind because it was never earned by the one who holds it. We need proof. We need more than proof. We need Flint to believe it, and Flint does not believe things that hurt. Evie looked at the stable door, at the gray sky beyond it, at the mountains that held Hollowore like cupped hands. He will believe me, she said. She was not certain of this. She said it anyway, because certainty was a luxury and conviction was a tool, and she had survived this long by knowing the difference. That night, she told Flint. She sat on the edge of his narrow bed in his sparse soldier's room, and she told him what Amos had said, and what Lanford had suspected, and what her own instincts screamed. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched the gray eyes go still, then hard, then bright with something that was not anger but was adjacent to it, something that lived in the space between betrayal and grief. No, he said. Flint. Amos held me when my mother died. He stood beside my father's pyre. He taught me to read treaties and to hold a council vote, and to keep my voice level when everything in me wanted to howl. And he has been feeding your strategies to Harlan for 3 years. Flint stood. He walked to the window. He placed both hands on the stone sill and stood there, silhouetted against the night sky. And Evie saw the tremor in his shoulders, the way his fingers dug into the stone. And she saw his eyes flash, just once, a brief flare of amber gold that was not human, that belonged to the other self, the wolf that lived inside him, surfacing in a moment of pain that the man could not contain. How do we prove it? He asked, his voice rough, dropped an octave, the wolf bleeding through. The baker. Lanford knows. If we intercept the next letter before the vote, 9 days. We only need 1 letter. He turned from the window. His eyes were gray again, but the gold lingered at the edges, a ring of fire banked but not extinguished. He looked at her, and what she saw in his face was not the Bone King, not the Alpha King, not the cold commander. It was a man who had just learned that the ground he stood on was hollow, and the only thing keeping him from falling was the woman sitting on his bed. Stay, he said. In the arrangement? In this room, tonight. Not for the witnesses, not for the performance. His voice was barely audible. I do not want to be alone with this. Evie stood. She crossed the small room and took his hand, and they sat together on the narrow bed with their backs against the cold stone wall. And she held his hand in the dark, while something between them, the hum, the pull, the thread, grew taut and luminous and undeniable. She did not sleep, neither did he. But sometime before dawn, his head dropped against her shoulder, heavy and warm, and his breathing changed, and she realized that the Bone King, who did not sleep, was sleeping. And her heart broke open so quietly that she barely felt it happen. The letter was intercepted on the 17th day. Lanford, with the help of a loyal stable hand and the baker's wife, who had apparently been waiting 3 years for someone to ask the right questions, retrieved the correspondence from the false bottom of a flour barrel. It was written in Amos's precise hand, addressed to Harlan Stewart, and it detailed, in clinical language, the exact strategy Flint had outlined in his council meeting 4 days prior, along with the recommendation that the vote be pressed immediately, before the consort bond could solidify further. It also contained a single line that made Evie's blood run cold. The girl is clever but common. The bond is nascent at best. A challenge during the vote ceremony, combined with a formal demand for proof of consummation, will break them both. Flint read the letter in silence. He read it twice. Then he folded it, placed it on his desk, and said in a voice that was perfectly level and absolutely terrifying, "Summon the council." What happened next happened fast. Evie had expected a confrontation, a dramatic unmasking, perhaps a shouting match in the Great Hall. What she got was something far more devastating. Flint, standing before his assembled council, reading Amos's letter aloud in a voice that did not waver, while Amos sat in his carved chair and aged 10 years and 10 minutes. The regent did not deny it. That was the worst part. He simply sat, his silver head bowed, and when Flint finished reading, Amos looked up and said, "Everything I did for Hollowore. You did it for Harlan's gold. I did it because you are your father's ghost, Flint, and Hollowore cannot survive on ghosts. Harlan is practical. Harlan would modernize. Harlan would open the trade routes and fill the coffers, and you would rather freeze in this granite tomb protecting border folk who will never amount to anything." The council chamber went silent. Evie watched Flint's hands. They were at his sides and the knuckles were white, and she could see the claws beginning to press against his fingertips, dark and curved, the wolf surging forward. She stood. She crossed the chamber floor, stepped between Flint and the table, and placed her hand flat against his chest. His heart was hammering. The hum between them roared. "Not like this," she said quietly. "He does not deserve your rage. He deserves your law." Flint looked down at her. His eyes were gold, fully gold, the wolf staring out through the man's face. And for a moment, Evie stood at the intersection of two selves, the human king and the animal sovereign. And she felt both of them see her, truly see her, with an intensity that should have been terrifying and was instead the steadiest thing she had ever felt. The gold receded. The gray returned. Flint's hand came up and covered hers against his chest. "Exile," he said, his voice rough. "Ancient law grants mercy over execution when the accused has served the house for more than 20 years. Lord Amos, you are stripped of title, lands, and the right to return to Hollowore or any of its vassal territories. You will leave at first light." Amos stood. He looked at Evie, and in his eyes she saw not repentance, but calculation. Even now, even at the end, the mind still turning, still measuring. "You think you have won," he said to her. "You think this common girl with her common blood has saved your house. But Harlan still has the votes. The vote is in 3 days, and you still have no proof of bond." He smiled. It was the last time Evie ever saw him smile. The night before the vote, Evie stood at the window of Flint's chamber and watched the moon rise over the mountains, full and heavy and silver-white, and she felt the hum in her chest crescendo, like a symphony approaching its final movement. Flint was behind her. She could feel him without turning. The heat of him, the weight of his attention, the way the air between them had become a living thing, charged and trembling. "They will challenge the bond," she said. "Yes." "They will demand proof of consummation." "Yes." "And we have not." "No." She turned. He was closer than she expected, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, the way his gray eyes had gone dark, the way his chest rose and fell with a control that was costing him visible effort. "Flint, I will not ask you." He said it fiercely, almost angrily, his hands fisted at his sides. "I will not ask you to seal a bond for politics. I will not be the man who takes from you to save his throne. I would rather lose Hollowore." "You cannot lose Hollowore. Trinity, the border folk, the pack." "I know." "Then stop being noble for one moment and listen to me." She stepped closer. The hum was deafening now, a resonance that filled the room, that vibrated in the stone walls and the wooden beams and the narrow space between their bodies. She placed her hands on his chest, over his heart, and felt it pounding, wild and desperate, and matched exactly, beat for beat, with her own. "This is not pretense," she said. "This has not been pretense for weeks. What I feel for you is not arrangement. It is not performance. It is the truest thing I have ever felt, and I am tired of being afraid of it." Something in Flint broke. Not violently, not destructively. The way ice breaks in spring, along fissures that were always there, releasing what was trapped beneath. He made a sound, low in his chest, not quite a word and not quite a growl, something that belonged to both the man and the wolf, and his hands came up and framed her face, rough and trembling and achingly gentle. "Evie." Her name again. A prayer, a vow, an undoing. "I have wanted you since the moment you looked at me in that hall and asked me why. No one has ever asked me why. They assume, they obey, they fear. You asked. You answered. I will always answer you." He kissed her, or she kissed him, or they met somewhere in the space between intention and surrender, and it did not matter who moved first, because the hum became a roar, and the thread became a chain, and everything narrowed to the press of his mouth against hers, the taste of him, the way his hands held her face like she was the most precious and the most dangerous thing he had ever touched. He pulled back. His forehead rested against hers. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were gold at the edges again, the wolf present, watching, waiting. "Tell me to stop," he said. "I will stop. Do not stop." He kissed her again, deeper, and the world tilted, and somewhere in the keep, old Dexter sat up in her chair and pressed her hand to her chest and smiled, because the sympathetic vibration between the Alpha King and the girl in the gray dress had just become a chord, and it was ringing through the stones of Hollowore like a bell that had been waiting centuries to be struck. When Flint's mouth found the curve of her neck, the place where the claiming mark would rest, he stopped. He pulled back. He looked at her with those gray gold eyes and asked, his voice a ruin, "Are you certain?" "Yes. This cannot be undone. I do not want it undone." He kissed the skin there, softly, a reverence before a sacrament. and then his teeth found the curve of her shoulder, and Evie gasped, not from pain, but from the flood, the cascade of warmth and light and connection that poured through her like a river breaking through a dam. She felt him. Not just his body against hers, but his heart, his fear, his love. The vast, aching landscape of a man who had been alone so long that tenderness had become a foreign language. And she felt him relearning it against her skin, syllable by syllable, kiss by kiss. The bond sealed. The room filled with light, faint and golden, emanating from the place where his mark rested on her skin, and Evie felt the thread between them become a bridge, wide and luminous, and she crossed it and found him waiting on the other side. The vote was held at noon in the great hall, with every elder, every council member, every bond witness, and Harlan Corey himself present. Harlan was a tall man, lean where Flint was broad, polished where Flint was scarred, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had already counted his winnings. His challenge was formal and precise. He questioned the bond, questioned the haste, questioned the legitimacy of a consort chosen in desperation from the dregs of the choosing gala. He said dregs with a smile, and the word landed in the hall like a slap, and Evie felt Flint go rigid beside her, felt the rage rise through the bond like heat from a forge. She placed her hand on his arm. Steady. He steadied. "I call for proof of bond," Harlan said, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment. "Let the witnesses read them. Let the council see what is or is not between this alpha and his convenient bride." Old Dexter rose from her seat. She walked to the center of the hall, slow and deliberate, and she stopped before Flint and Evie and closed her eyes. The hall went silent. Dexter opened her eyes. "The bond is true," she said. "Full, sealed, and singing. I have not felt its like in 40 years. Harlan's smile faltered. "One witness proves nothing. The old woman is sentimental. I demand a full reading from all 3 witnesses." The second witness, a younger man named Callum, rose and confirmed. The third, a woman from the eastern border, did the same. 3 witnesses, 3 confirmations. The bond rang through the hall like a tuned bell, visible now to those with eyes to see it, a faint golden thread that shimmered in the air between Flint and Evie like heat rising from summer stone. Harlan's composure cracked. He turned to the council, searching for the support Amos had promised, and found empty faces. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "The Alpha King is weak. He harbored a traitor regent for years without seeing it. He chose a common ward with no bloodline, no power, no standing. Hollowore deserves better." "Hollowore deserves a leader who protects it," Evie said. She had not planned to speak. The words rose from somewhere deep, somewhere the bond lived, and they carried a weight that surprised even her. "You speak of modernization and trade routes and mineral leases. You speak of numbers on a ledger. Flint speaks of people, border folk, children, the ones who have no voice in this hall." "You are one of those voiceless things," Harlan said, and there was a cruelty in it that reminded Evie of the gallery, of the laughter, of the quill descending toward the page. What authority does a ward of a minor house presume to hold? He stepped toward her. He reached out, and whether he meant to grab her arm or merely gesture, Evie would never know. Because Flint moved. He moved the way large predators move, with a speed that seemed to violate the relationship between mass and momentum. And he was between Harlan and Evie in a single heartbeat, and his hand was around Harlan's wrist, and his eyes were fully gold. And when he spoke, it was with 2 voices, the man and the wolf, layered and harmonic and terrible. "Touch her," Flint said, "and I will end you here, in front of your own witnesses, and the law will call it justified." Harlan went white. The hall held its breath. And then Evie felt it. Not the hum, not the bond, but something else entirely. Something that had been sleeping inside her since before she could remember, awakened now by the surge of fear and love and desperate protective fury that poured through the bond from Flint's heart to hers. Light erupted from her hands, silver-white light, pure and blinding, that poured from her palms and filled the great hall like moonlight concentrated to a physical force. It was not destructive. It was protective. It formed a barrier, a shimmering dome that enclosed Flint and Evie and radiated outward, and where it touched the walls, ancient carvings that had been dark for centuries began to glow. Runes and symbols of a language older than the pack, older than the kingdom, older than memory. Dexter gasped. "The old blood," she whispered. "The healer's line. It was supposed to be extinct." Evie did not hear her. She was consumed by the light, by the power that roared through her like a river finding the sea, by the knowledge, sudden and absolute and dazzling, that she was not common, had never been common, that the blood in her veins carried the inheritance of the first healers, the ones who had raised these very walls and carved these very runes and laid the foundations on which Hollowore stood. The light pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then Evie's knees buckled. Flint caught her. Of course he caught her. He gathered her against his chest, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, and he held her as the light faded and the hall erupted into murmuring chaos. Harlan stood in the center of the floor, his challenge dead on his lips, his faction scattered, his claim dissolved by the undeniable reality that the Alpha King's consort carried the old blood and the stones of Hollowore itself had risen to acknowledge her. The council voted. It was not close. Flint Core remained Alpha King of Hollowore by a margin so decisive that the recording secretary ran out of tally marks and had to start a second column. Harlan left the hall without a word. He would leave Hollowore territory by nightfall, by choice or by escort, and the border he crossed would be the same one Amos had crossed 3 days before, and neither of them would ever return. 6 months later, on a morning so bright it felt like the world had been polished, Evie sat in the garden beside the river with Duchess, the one-eared cat, in her lap, and Trinity at her feet, drawing wolves that had improved considerably in the intervening months, and now looked less like potatoes and more like actual animals, albeit animals with an ambitious number of legs. The terraced gardens were in full bloom, the air thick with the scent of herbs and wildflowers, and the keep behind them glowed in the morning sun, pale granite turned to gold. Flint found her there. He came down the garden path in his shirt sleeves, no armor, no black leather, just linen and sunlight, and the faintest trace of a smile that would have shocked his council if they could see it. He sat beside her on the stone bench. Duchess immediately abandoned Evie's lap for Flint's, because Duchess was a traitor and always had been. "Lanford says the Eastern Road is finished," Flint said. "The border villages will have direct trade access by autumn." "And the new school?" "Trinity has already claimed the largest desk. She informed the schoolmaster that she will be teaching the first lesson, which will be on the subject of interesting rocks." "She gets that from you." "She does not. The rock collection on your desk says otherwise." His jaw flexed, but it was different now. The flex accompanied by a softening at the corners of his mouth, a warmth in his gray eyes that he no longer bothered to hide. The bond hummed between them, steady and golden, a constant, quiet song that underlay every moment of every day. Trinity looked up from her drawing. "Evie, are you getting fat?" Flint choked on nothing. Evie looked down at the gentle curve of her belly, still early, still secret, or so she had thought, because apparently nothing was secret from a 5-year-old with sharp eyes and no filter. "I am growing something," Evie said carefully. "Like a garden?" "Something like that." Trinity considered this with the gravity of a philosopher weighing a proposition. "Can I name it?" We will discuss it. I want to name it Duchess. We will definitely discuss it. Flint's hand found hers on the bench between them. His fingers laced through hers, warm and rough and steady. And he leaned close, his mouth beside her ear, and he said, so quietly that only she in the bond could hear, "Thank you." For what? For asking me why. Evie turned her face into his neck, where the scent of pine and stone and home lived, and she smiled against his skin. The river murmured, the cat purred. Trinity returned to her drawing, adding a fifth leg to the wolf because 4 simply did not seem sufficient. And Hollowore, ancient and enduring, settled around them like a cloak, like a promise, like the first breath of a fire that would never go out. So, what would you rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10? Drop your rating in the comments, and if Evie and Flint's journey made your heart race even a little, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We have something incredible coming next week, and trust me, you are not going to want to miss it.